Now that you've analyzed the data and you know what values you have available and you have kind of a full picture of what you're able to model with your machine learning model. So this is the point where we get it ready to actually start training our model. So we'll start first by cleaning the data. And we talked about this just a little bit in the last section on data analysis, but this is where we'll reformat any values or types. So for example, maybe you have a string that's coming in your data, but you actually need it to be some type of numerical type. In the preparation stage, this is where you'll handle those types of usually repetitive cleanup tasks. And again, this is where you'll handle things like any empty values for columns you need data for, or any null values that you can set with some kind of default value. You'll go ahead and do that in this preparation step. And if there's any type of validation errors, so maybe at some point in your data integration phase, you have a script that runs and tells you where the problemed areas are in your different data sources, and you can go ahead and fix any validation errors that come up from there. So once you've got the data cleaned, you know what values to expect, the types that you're looking for, you can go ahead and start your feature engineering. So we'll take a look at things like how do you scale your data? If you're working with numerical values that really go over a large range, you'll probably want to figure out what scale to use for that data. And then how do you want to handle your outliers? Because back to our example of rural Nebraska ordering really expensive products, maybe they really are just an outlier group. And most of your customers are in large urban centers on the West Coast. So how do you want to handle those outliers, and what type of weight do you want to give them in your data? And then you might look at something like log transforms. So this is one of the ways that you can standardize and normalize your data so that you don't have these values that are really all over the place and you can't quite use them in your model to give you any type of meaningful information. So after you've gone through this next step of your feature engineering and you've got everything scaled, you know what values to expect, you know what combinations of values create which features you need, it's time for labeling. So this is the fun part. We're getting even closer to making our first machine learning experiments. But to get there, when we have to label data, there's usually some level of manual input. Because while we can automate a lot of this process, there are some times where we don't have a machine learning model to label our data for us. So you'll have to go in with maybe a subject matter expert depending on what type of machine learning project this is. For example, if it's something in the medical field and you're labeling images, you'll definitely want to consult with an expert in that field to get the correct labels. But again, there are tools that can help us with this manual labeling process. So there's Label Studio. Again, we have some AWS tools. There's Sloth and Labelbox. So these are just a few of the tools that you have available that can help speed up this process of labeling your data. Once you have everything labeled, we're getting even closer to the part where you can start training your models and we need to segment our data. So you'll typically want at least these three data sets. You'll have a data set for training your model, you'll have one for testing that model, and then you'll have one for validating that model. And the reason it's important to keep these three data sets completely separate is so that we don't run the risk of testing or validating our model with the same data that we trained it with. Keep in mind that data preparation is probably the longest part of building an ML model, because this is where you really have to go through and do a lot of that statistical work to get the data in the format that works best for the resources you have available and for the models that you're thinking about experimenting with. So it takes a while to get the labels correct. It takes time to get those experts to review things for you. And it takes time to figure out how and where and when you clean your data and how you want to sort it. There are a lot of things that go into this step, and it is probably the most important step, because this is how you prep the data that the model is trained on and validated against. This is where you really want to be sure that you're checking for any biases in your data or the way that you're doing feature engineering, because everything that you have at this step will directly impact the rest of your MLOps cycle. And the great part about MLOps is that it will help you save some time on this part of the process, because you can automate a lot of things. So you might have several servers running to help prepare this data for you, and you get through a lot of those parts faster because you don't have to do one at a time, and you can take the same scripts and have this reproducibility for all of the data that you ingest.